I publicized this session 9 days ago, and when I did, even 9 days ago, things looked very differently. On Sunday, the big news was a Hezbollah attack from the north, from Lebanon into Israel, that was dealt with preemptively. And had we done the session last Sunday, that probably would have been the main focus of what we were going to be speaking about. On Monday, Itamar Ben-Gvir, Israel's Minister of National Security, made a statement regarding potentially changing the status quo on the Temple Mount, Al-Aqsa, Haram al-Sharif, the noble sanctuary where the Dome of the Rock and the roots of the Jewish temple stand, speaking about Jewish prayer at the site and potentially, even when pushed, perhaps building a synagogue. And I think if we'd had this session on Monday, that probably would have been the first thing that everyone would have wanted to speak about. On Tuesday, the atmosphere in Israel was very different. On Tuesday, Farhan Al-Qadi, who was one of the hostages taken on October the 7th, was rescued alive from inside one of the Gaza tunnels, the Hamas tunnels inside Gaza. And the atmosphere in Israel was completely different to the atmosphere that we have today. So had we done the session on Tuesday, perhaps I would have come in from a very different perspective, perhaps. On Wednesday, widespread IDF operations began inside the West Bank, attempting to deal with Hamas and Jihad, and also Iran-funded linked independent militant terrorists inside the West Bank. And of course, the question of Israeli operations inside the West Bank, settlements and settlers inside the West Bank is a very, very hot topic. And that probably would have been one of the first things that you would have wanted to speak about on Wednesday. On Thursday, there was a security cabinet meeting regarding something called the Philadelphia Corridor, which we'll speak more about. Some of you may know, some of you may not. It's a narrow strip of land at the very southern tip of the Gaza Strip along the border with Egypt. And the hot topic of whether the IDF forces who are currently inside that strip of land, whether they should be inside that strip, or whether as part of a potential ceasefire agreement, they should remove themselves from that strip of land. A meeting of the Security Cabinet passed by 8 votes to 1 that no Israeli forces should be removed from the Philadelphia Corridor. One of the core demands of Hamas is that any ceasefire agreement and any release of hostages is conditioned upon Israel removing forces from that corridor. So of course that changed everything as well. And moving through to Saturday, on Saturday I heard people talking about polio before, as I was logging myself in, that right now, and it really began in earnest on Saturday, but officially today, began a program of the United Nations, the World Health Organization, and various non-profits to administer somewhere in the order of 1.2 million doses of a polio vaccination to children in Gaza who haven't received vaccinations as a result of everything that's been going on over the last almost 1 year. And that's a hot topic, and that's also something that was written to me about as well. We also know that on Saturday evening here in Israel, we started to get rumors of hostages bodies being found. And officially this morning, very early on this morning here in Israel, there's been confirmation that 6 dead hostages, the bodies were extracted from Gaza. And that again has completely changed the landscape here in Israel. And this is a huge topic. And even as I tell you this, as we were still reeling from the news of the discovery of 6 dead bodies and the bodies of 6 hostages inside Gaza, we hear the news that in a drive-by shooting attack, that 3 Israeli police at a checkpoint close to Hebron inside the West Bank were shot dead. And that's also all happening today. And even as we're on air, we're finding out, and I'm sure even during, if you're Googling as we're going through the session, you're going to hear more and more things are happening. The reason I mention this is because when we're planning this, when I was thinking about planning the session, I realized that it wasn't really possible to sit down 9 days ago and plan the session that I was going to do for you today. We could speak about general themes, but ultimately, the atmosphere in the country, which is part of what many of you wanted to speak about, what's going on, how do people feel, and how are those outside of Israel feeling about what's going on, is so much conditioned upon changing events that are happening all the time. I can tell you that despite the fact that every day this week we could have approached the session in a different way and with a different mindset, I can tell you that today is the 1st of September. Here in Israel, this is the big first day back at school. And for anyone who has family in Israel, lives in Israel, has lived in Israel, you'll know that on the 1st of September, the whole of Facebook or Instagram is clogged up with pictures that parents take of their children going back to school. And today, it didn't happen, not in the same way. There were still pictures here and there, but it didn't happen in the same way. The idea of being able to put pictures out, to celebrate, to think positively about the year ahead, mentally, psychologically, is something that most people in Israel just didn't really feel able to do today. And I can say honestly, as I was getting my kids ready this morning and hearing and seeing the rumors being confirmed of young people, older people that have been killed, and we'll talk more about them, that to think about your own children and to think about the children that have been taken across the board, to think about thousands of children that are going to school today because they don't have a father, don't have a mother. Speaking of mainly the fathers, fallen soldiers, also reservists, many thousands and thousands of men, predominantly men, also women, but predominantly men, who have been away from their families for much of the last 11 months. Families that have become de facto one-parent families, children that are growing up in these formative times or spending the summer holidays away from school, not having their parents or not having a parent around them. Kids in the south, in the area around Gaza, children in almost the entirety of the Upper Galilee that have been evacuated, that have been a year away from their homes, a year away from their schools, a year away from their friends, their families. And these are the things that are on our mind here in Israel, together with all of the geopolitics. These are the things that are on my mind personally, if I'm honest with you today. Nonetheless, we're going to zoom out and we're going to speak about the different issues. I went through all of the events over the last week, and we're going to use those as a window to. We're going to use those as a window. I can see someone has written on the side, just as I noticed, it's important to say the 6 hostages appear to have been shot, and we're going to speak all about them. Okay, we're going to zoom out and we're going to speak about the different huge issues, overarching issues that are, I would suggest, hanging over Israeli society, and then we're going to go inwards into the micro rather, and speak about those and others. So 2 huge issues that are really hanging over Israeli society right now, I would suggest, is the issue of the hostages that we're speaking about, and some of you are also speaking about on the chat right now, and security fears, whether that's Hezbollah, whether it's Hamas, whether it's the Houthis, whether it's Iran, whether it's more and more threats that are emanating from the West Bank. These are the things that Israelis are thinking about on a daily basis. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to attempt to deal with each of these things in turn. So the first thing I want to speak about is a little bit about Hezbollah and the north. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go north. So again, if you take a look over here, okay, it's the area that we're looking at over here of southern Lebanon. And we're going to speak for a few minutes about Hezbollah. I apologize for those that have a great depth of information and knowledge, and for those that need a little refresher. So I'm going to attempt to line things up for everyone. First of all, a few words about Hezbollah. Hezbollah were founded is an organization, a terror organization, that was founded in 1982. One of the most important things to say is that it's a Shia Islamic organization, a Lebanese organization. So the founders of Hezbollah are Lebanese, but they are Shia. Shia is a group within Islam that makes up approximately 15% of the Islamic world today. Now, Hezbollah was founded by the Lebanese, but it was, from its very inception, funded and supported and in certain ways directed by the Islamic Republic of Iran, the Iranian Revolution that happened just 3 years previously. But 1982 is an important year because following incursions, terror attacks emanating from Lebanon into Israel, from the Palestinians, at that time, the PLO were based inside southern Lebanon, a war, the First Lebanon War begins. As a reaction to the First Lebanon War, Hezbollah come into being. A few points about what do Hezbollah want. Initially, Hezbollah were created with a view to expelling Israeli forces that entered in 1982 in that war, in the First Lebanon War, into Lebanon. In the year 2000, Israeli forces left Lebanon, but Hezbollah, rather than disband, became a much more powerful force. And today, Hezbollah have an incredibly large military, very, very powerful, much more powerful than the Lebanese military, largely speaking, in control of all the military facilities of Lebanon, also playing a pivotal role within the government of Lebanon, but also acting fully independently. We ask the question, why does Hezbollah continue to exist? And in very, very simple terms, we can say two things. One is a dedication to the destruction of the state of Israel. This is one very important piece. And the other is linked to Iran. Remember that I mentioned the Shia. And we won't go deep into the differences between Shia and Sunni. Shia and Sunni, the main differences initially are related to the fact that the Sunnah or the Sunni, the majority of Muslims in the world today, follow a path that suggests that the leadership of the Islamic world following the death of the Prophet Muhammad should be in the hands of the most capable or able leader. So the first leader for the Sunni is Abu Bakr, who was one of the close confidants of the Prophet Muhammad. For the Shia, they believe that the initial leadership within the Islamic world should have come from the direct blood relatives of the Prophet Muhammad. And so Ali, who was the cousin and the son-in-law of the Prophet Muhammad, was murdered. His son, the Prophet's grandson, Hussein, was also murdered. And so a large part of the Shia psyche is a feeling of korbanut or victimhood or a destruction or cutting off of the line of the Prophet Muhammad with regard to the leadership of the Islamic world. And when we think about Iran, when we're talking about the Shia Sunni, these large blocks, in previous sessions we've spoken about Saudi Arabia, the leadership of Saudi Arabia, of the Sunni Muslim world, and the Iran, the leadership of the Shia Islamic world. Part of it is trying to rectify this balance or bring more power and glory to the Shia Islamic world. And this is a connection between Hezbollah and the Iranians. And again, we'll speak more about that later on. Since October the 7th, Hezbollah have been firing rockets and sending drones into Israel constantly, over 7,000. So one of the things that was mentioned on Sunday is that there was a strike on Israel on Sunday, around 1 week ago. The reality is that it was not the first strike, certainly not. And when we speak about Israel taking a preemptive strike to limit the ability of the Hezbollah to attack Israel on Sunday, and we'll speak more about that in a moment, the word preemptive is a question, because preemptive would suggest that there was not already tit and tit, or go back and forth rather, between Hezbollah and Israel since October the 7th. Why specifically did Hezbollah strike on Sunday? And why did it strike on Sunday with the declared aim of making a huge impact inside Israel? Some of you already know that right at the very end of July, there were two major assassinations. One was the assassination inside Iran of Ismail Haniyeh, one of the leaders of Hamas. And the other was the assassination inside Lebanon of Fuad Shukr, who was the chief of staff or the main head of the military section of Hezbollah. That took place at the end of July. And since the end of July, Israel was waiting for a response from Iran. We'll speak more about Iran a little bit later on, and a response from Hezbollah. On Sunday, the mass rocket and drone attack on Sunday was the declared response of Hezbollah inside Israel. Now, again, some of you may be asking, why is this a response? Surely there have been constant drones. If any of you have been going online and following the news, you'll see images of mass destruction across the upper section of the Upper Galilee of Israel. Over 40 Israeli towns, cities, and villages have been evacuated. There is a huge amount of damage that has been done to this area. Somewhere in the order of 100,000 people or more have been evacuated officially, and many others have evacuated themselves from these areas. So what made this strike so different? one of the things that made this strike different was the intention to strike beyond the north of Israel and strike down towards, put it through, and strike down towards the center of Israel. Now, when we speak about the preemptive strike back of Israel, through very, very strong intelligence, managed to identify that this strike was about to take place and took out many of the missile launchers and many of the missiles in order that the plan of Hezbollah, the wide-ranging plan of Hezbollah, wouldn't come to fruition. And so on the one hand, there was relatively little material damage and physical damage to people inside Israel. There was a shot down rocket where the shrapnel hit someone inside Akko. Aside from this, relatively little damage. And this also gives us some kind of understanding of where exactly Hezbollah and Israel, or what game, if you hate to use the word game, is being played here. Because some would say that following these events, Hassan Nasrallah, we just saw him a few moments ago, here he is, the leader or the general secretary of the Hezbollah, came out and said that this was phase one of the retaliation. He intimated that, while Israel was saying there'd been very little damage, that actually there was a huge amount of damage which the Israeli establishment was hiding from the international media and from Israel. And you can take that how it will. I would suggest that in Israel, it's much more difficult to hide something that happens inside Israel, especially since one, for example, of the main targets was the 8200 unit, which is a major intelligence unit, and also in the same area near Ramat HaSharon, very close to Tel Aviv. It's also the area of the Israeli intelligence as well. This was one of the main areas that was due to be aimed at. And had anything happened in that area, almost certainly it's a very, very largely populated area. People would have known about it. Nonetheless, there were no rockets directly aimed at Tel Aviv. And this is interesting because I would suggest that on the one hand, it was important for the Hezbollah to make a statement that they could argue that they had successfully taken revenge for the assassination that Israel had done inside Lebanon of Fuad Shukr. On the other hand, and important to say, that had the plan been implemented fully and also included mass casualties inside Tel Aviv, invariably Israel would have struck back with supreme force following the strike, and we would now be talking about a regional war between Israel, Hezbollah, and others being drawn into it. Now, right now, this is certainly not a regional war that Israel wants to be brought into. First of all, because the USA certainly wants to avoid a regional war, and Israel at this time has no interest whatsoever in completely and utterly alienating itself from the wishes of the USA. Should also say that there are other forces also that would like to stop moving forward to a regional war. Can say also for Israel's perspective that Israel is currently stepping up operations inside the West Bank. It's dealing also still with a front in Gaza, which shows no sign of abating right now. And so the idea of opening up another major front in the north is not necessarily the perfect timing, if we can use that word, for Israel right now. Should also mention that it's not necessarily in Iran's interest for Hezbollah and Israel to enter into a war. If there is a full-scale war that takes place, this will have a massive impact on the over 100,000 rockets and missiles. And again, we can just see a little part of that right here. This is the border with Israel over here. And we can see the massing of Hezbollah weaponry over here in this area. In fact, I can show you over here. This is the border between Israel and Lebanon. Okay, this is an Israeli moshav or village called Zar'it over here. And this is the location of a Lebanese village called Marwahin. And look how close it is to the border. And just to show, this is actually an image inside Marwahin. And you can see a UN position, a United Nations position inside. You can also see a Palestinian flag, a statement of intent to support the Palestinians, picture of Hassan Nasrallah. And you can see all of this is incredibly close to the border with Israel. Now, were a major event, a major regional war to break out between Israel and Hezbollah, what I began to say is that this would massively erode, ultimately, even with mass damage to Israel, ultimately the damage to Hezbollah would be significant. The ability of Hezbollah for the next few years, perhaps a decade or more, to be able to effectively threaten on a mass basis Israel would be severely reduced if there was a full-scale war that was to take place right now. The reason I mention this is that we can ask the question whether Hassan Nasrallah is currently in a position where he wants that war to take place. And ultimately, in many ways, despite being a political and religious ideologue, he's also incredibly pragmatic and careful. But also, one of the main reasons that Hezbollah exists for the Iranians, from an Israeli interest, is to be a force that is able to be a bulwark against any Israeli threats to Iran. Iran is currently working on moving towards having a nuclear threat. And the idea is that the Hezbollah needs to be in play when Iran is able to strike Israel from a nuclear perspective, to impact Israel's ability to strike back at Iran in the event of a nuclear confrontation. So it's in Iran's interest that Hezbollah doesn't deplete its ability to serve that role. Complicated, but this is all going on. In the meantime, where do we stand right now? So we have the two sides wishing to avoid a full-scale war. We also have the Russians also putting pressure on the Iranians to put pressure on Hezbollah not to descend into a full-scale war, and also for the Iranians not to strike directly as well. So the whole world, as we know, is affected by what's going on in this very, very small area. But I do want to mention for a moment, as I started to speak about before, about what's going on in Israel. I mentioned tens, if not over 100,000 people living in the north are directly affected on a daily basis by the threat of drones and rockets falling where they live or not being able to live. Practically huge swathes of the north of Israel are unlivable and have been evacuated. And that continues to be the case. So there is an awful lot of fear for those living in the north. There is also a lot of anger and resentment against the government. On the one hand, there was a lot of hand clapping or patting on the back for the success of Israel's preemptive strike last Sunday. On the other hand, there were also opinions being voiced about why is it that Israel reacted on Sunday, perhaps because on Sunday they were talking about Hezbollah aiming towards the center of the country and not doing enough for those people that are affected only in the north. Again, the idea that those people in the north have been set aside or have not been looked after, or their interests being listened to in the way that Israel or the government would do for those people living in the center of the country. I will, just before I saw a question in the chat, but I'll come back to it in a few moments' time. One thing I would say is, how could all of this be diffused? So first of all, the likelihood is right now, and we mentioned that neither Hezbollah or Israel necessarily want to have a war now. That's not to say that Hezbollah isn't committed to Israel not existing, and nor that in an ideal world that Israel wouldn't like Hezbollah to no longer be any kind of threat or future threat to Israel. But practically speaking, how could this be diffused? And the answer in very, very simple terms is Security Council Resolution 1701 from 2006. The end of the Second Lebanon War in 2006, the Security Council resolution or ceasefire was signed between the warring sides, Hezbollah, Lebanon by proxy, and Israel, is that you can see here there is a river called the Litani River. This is inside Lebanon. And according to the resolution, this area over here, beneath the Litani River, needs to be a demilitarized area, and Hezbollah needs to remove all of its forces and all of its weapons to the north of the Litani River. Were Hezbollah to do so, it would have a much, much more difficult job in using accurate visual weaponry against people in the north of Israel. And largely speaking, that would be likely enough in order, together with other security provisions, to start considering rebuilding areas of the north of Israel and moving people back in. On the other hand, if Hezbollah were to move north of the Litani River after Hassan Nasrallah has declared over the last year that he will not do so, if they were to do so, it would be seen as a failure for Hezbollah, or shame, which is of course a very major part both of Lebanese, Islamic, and Arab culture. So the shame of retreating, so to speak, makes it a very difficult thing. Ideally, a moving back of Hezbollah to the north of the Litani River would leave Hezbollah intact. It would enable them to attack Israel on another day. It would enable Iran to maintain Hezbollah as a bulwark in the event of a future nuclear confrontation, and it would allow the government of Israel to argue that the population could move back in. The question is, how do we arrive to that situation? But we'll leave that question for another day. In the meantime, I'm going to move on a little bit more. As I said, I'm going to try and summarize as much as I can, and then we'll open things up for questions. And I want to speak a little bit about the South. As many of you know, those of us that have spoken together before, that since the beginning of the war, the declared aims of the government, and for anyone who has visited Israel over the last year, you will know it from walking around the street, that the aims of the war with Hamas, when we're now focusing in specifically on Hamas and the terror organizations inside Gaza, is the defeat of Hamas. And as the government, as Netanyahu is even emphasizing, the complete dismantling of the ability of Hamas to rule militarily and politically inside the Gaza Strip. And the second aim, the return of the hostages. Now, in simple terms, both of these aims seem absolutely correct. It's important to bring every single hostage taken by Hamas, Jihad, and Palestinian residents on October the 7th and bring them back to Israel. And it's incredibly important that Hamas is no longer a threat to the citizens of the state of Israel. These slogans are universally approved. But what does it mean in practice, especially when we understand that, and we're seeing it right now with the question of the hostages, that if the move towards the total and utter defeat of Hamas, and again, we can also open the question, what does that mean? And is it possible to completely and utterly defeat Hamas? But we'll park that to the side. But if the aim of focusing on destroying the ability of Hamas to rule militarily and politically inside the Strip, if that is the number one aim, does that stand at odds with the ability for Israel to negotiate and make concessions in order to potentially return hostages alive and dead from Gaza? This is really, if we're talking about Israeli society, this is a battle that we're grappling with. And I'll just add as a small caveat that before October the 7th, many of you are familiar with the arguments between religious and secular, left and right, judicial reform, and these schisms or splits between within Israeli society. And in many ways, these splits haven't gone away, but are now being expressed in, I would suggest, in this argument between which of those two aims, the defeat of Hamas and the return of the hostages, which one should be prioritized. Now, important for me to say that militarily, the IDF has been, I would argue, very successful over the course of the last 11 months in destroying Hamas's operational capabilities. If we're talking about Rafah, if you remember the discussions over whether Israel should or shouldn't go into Rafah, what would happen if Israel would or wouldn't go into Rafah, that the IDF has learned very quickly how to do the warfare, the number of civilian casualties proportionally vis-a-vis the number of terrorist militants has dropped dramatically. The amount of damage to civilian infrastructure has pro rata fallen considerably. So the IDF has learned very quickly over the course of this conflict, whatever your political opinions are. According to the IDF, the Rafah brigade of Hamas, the last one fully standing, has largely been destroyed and is now operating in an ad hoc fashion. It means that most of the warfare that's now going on in Gaza is predominantly counterinsurgency, as opposed to now dealing with organized forces. And that along the area of the Philadelphia corridor, that area between Gaza and Egypt, somewhere in the order of 80% of the tunnels have been destroyed. So militarily, things are in a good place. Things are, one could argue, in a good place. But there is a very big difference between operational tactics and military acts and long-term plans and thinking about the day after. And this is really, again, the big question that is still being asked, not only inside Israel, but also outside, is that what will happen when Israeli forces withdraw? One of the things that's been said this week, one of the politicians in the opposition, Benny Gantz, who was previously part of the security cabinet, said that there will be, he believed there will be Israeli forces inside Gaza for the next decade. So we can ask the question, what would happen when Israeli forces withdraw? If there is a full withdrawal of Israeli forces, which is ultimately what Hamas are demanding, with small concessions, but Hamas are demanding essentially a full removal of Israeli forces from the Strip. If that happens, is there a viable alternative to Hamas? Will Hamas be able to rearrange and take control once more? Is there still broad support inside the Strip for Hamas? So these are the very big questions. If Israel doesn't leave the Strip, who will be prepared to come into the Strip, be it the Palestinian Authority, international forces, American, Arab forces related to the Abraham Accord countries? Who will be prepared to, Egypt, who will be prepared to come into the Strip if Israel is still in possession of certain areas of the Strip? For example, the Philadelphia corridor or the Netzarim corridor that we'll speak about in a few moments. And again, coming back to this idea of what does total victory look like and whether it's possible. This is an incredibly pertinent one. I want to speak for a few moments about the hostages. I mentioned before that earlier this week, we had a good day, if you will, or a day that felt good for many people inside Israel. And that was the Israeli forces rescuing Farhan al-Qadi from inside one of the Gaza tunnels. Only the 8th Israeli hostage to be rescued alive from inside Gaza through military operations, and the first one to be found alive inside tunnels. It's believed that there was intelligence that it's possible that there was someone in the area. It wasn't known specifically that Farhan al-Qadi was specifically in the area, or that he was in that specific tunnel, but he was encountered inside the tunnel. He'd been abandoned inside the tunnel. The tunnel had actually been booby-trapped so that if he was able to escape, that he would be killed whilst escaping, and he was actually able to explain where the booby traps were to the IDF inside the tunnel so that neither he or they would be blown up. And he was brought back inside Israel. Huge excitement inside Israel and a huge ray of hope, if you will. And also, and I'll show you a separate picture. This is the pictures that we were seeing inside the hospital. There are videos some of you may have seen of Farhan's brother and family members running through the hospital in the Soroka Hospital in Beersheba, coming to greet their family member who had returned from Gaza. You can also see the Jewish religious Israeli doctor here. And so these scenes, this idea of the Israeli forces rescuing a Bedouin Muslim Arab from Gaza, the pictures of everyone together. And this was also buttressed by al-Qadi's own words. He explained and spoke about his excitement at hearing Hebrew when he heard the Israeli troops inside the tunnel. He was speaking about how each and every one of the Israeli troops gave him a hug, or gave him a cuddle on the way back. He was also explaining that he was held in captivity with Aryeh Zalmanovich, or Zalman, who was taken hostage from Nir Oz on October the 7th, who passed away, who died in captivity. And he was speaking about his conversations and how after Zalman passed away, that he tried to keep Zalman's stories, and they were talking about how they would meet afterwards and how they would go and visit each other's homes after what happened, and that there was those stories keeping him going. And he also said, no one can break this unity. Israel is a mother to all of us. We're all one big family. In the army, Bedouins, Druze, and Jews fight together. So these words, not only the rescue of a hostage, but also this idea of something that Israelis can all come together around, was something that was temporarily a shot, like an injection of positivity inside Israel. But it didn't, unfortunately, last very long. And I should also mention that many of the hostage families expressed immediately great joy for the family, but also great fear and worry about what the government was doing in order to bring their own families back, and we'll speak more about that in a few moments' time. A few words about the ceasefire. Since May, there have been build-up and speaking about agreements trying to be put together by mediators, by Egypt, by Qatar, a lot of American pressure, certainly for a ceasefire to take place before the American elections, trying to move things forward. On the table is another round of negotiations due to take place in Cairo. In very simple terms, the plan is based on 3 phases, each phase being 6 weeks long. The first phase would see the return of approximately 33 Israeli hostages, women and children. And in return for each Israeli hostage, Israel would be responsible for giving between 30 to 50 Palestinian security prisoners in return for each of the hostages. Part of the demand is also that Israel will withdraw from the Philadelphia corridor, which I'm going to speak about, that corridor between Gaza and Egypt, and the area also of the Rafah crossing, the crossing between Egypt and Gaza as well. This is a core demand of the mediators, Qatar and Egypt, which has threatened to cut off relations with Israel if this demand is not met, and also Hamas as well. The second phase, according to the plan that is on the table, is the return of a significant number of further prisoners, all the further living hostages that are being held inside Gaza. On the final phase of the plan, and that was also within that 6 weeks period, the negotiation of a permanent ceasefire. And the final part, in the final 6 weeks, will be the return of all those hostages that are no longer alive. So it's a very, very difficult situation. Up until this week, the US has intimated that Hamas is responsible for delaying progress in the plan. This is also what we're hearing from the Israeli government as well. Netanyahu is also saying that it's Hamas that are delaying and not genuinely coming to the table with the intention of actually securing a ceasefire agreement and a return of the hostages. Benjamin Netanyahu, Israeli Prime Minister, has emphasized that any permanent ceasefire cannot leave Hamas in control of Gaza in any capacity. Now, according to the Americans, they and Israel are on the same page on this. What Israel and the Americans are potentially not on the same page about is about the Philadelphia corridor. And so let me just very briefly show you the corridors that we're speaking about. We'll put to the side the Netzarim corridor, which is a corridor over here. It's a strip of land that Israeli forces are based inside in order to limit the ability of militants, terrorists, to make their way back into Gaza City and the northern section of Gaza. These corridors are also considered important because the idea is that when the Israeli forces are withdrawing from large swathes of Gaza as part of a future agreement, that by Israeli forces being based in these areas, it will mean the ability for Israel to continue counterinsurgency operations and still act quickly and respond quickly inside Gaza will still be possible. And when we're speaking about the Philadelphia corridor, we're speaking about this area over here. Now, when we return to the 1990s and the Oslo Accords, when Israel withdrew from around 80% of Gaza as part of the Oslo Accords, it maintained settlements inside Gaza, which were later withdrawn in 2005, and it also retained this strip over here and control of this strip of land over here. It was in 2005 when Israel withdrew from the Gaza Strip that it withdrew from this area as well. And so again, in the Israeli psyche, the Israeli memory is that following the withdrawal from 2005, which many Israelis see as an attempt to create a de facto or a nisayon or a trial Palestinian state by withdrawing all Israeli forces, what was seen was the rise of Hamas, the rise of rockets, and that this corridor is an essential part, an essential player in the security of the State of Israel. On the other hand, we also understand, as we were speaking about before, those two aims: to secure Israel and defeat Hamas, and to bring the hostages back. That maintaining control of this strip of land is also potentially a barrier to a hostage deal. And I started to mention that on Wednesday, President Biden of the United States with Vice President Harris on the same call stressed two things. First of all, US defensive support for Israel against Iran and its proxies. We'll speak more about the amount of military support that practically and physically that America is sending and coordinating, and also sending forces, ships to the region in order to try and deter Iran from acting against Israel. But at the same time, he also asked for flexibility on the Philadelphia corridor, which one can interpret as the idea that the government, Benjamin Netanyahu, who was on the call with, should be flexible about the idea that Israeli forces under no circumstances can be removed from this area over here. So Israeli presence in the area is seen as a barrier by the mediators. It's seen as essential by many people in Israel. I should mention that there are certain polls inside Israel that suggest that still the majority of Israelis do see that some kind of Israeli presence in this area as essential. But on the other hand, we also understand that the majority of people in Israel want to see a prioritization of the return of hostages, and that these two things seem to stand one against the other. Mention again, why is there opposition to the withdrawal from the corridor? First of all, that the argument is that only by being in the corridor is Israel able to physically stop the smuggling and rearming of Hamas. I should also mention that one of the critiques of the Israeli military is that the Israeli military since October the 7th began in the north and came down south. And one of the questions, including that I've heard from within the military establishment, is could it have been possible to start over here and cut the smuggling, cut the ability of Hamas to be resupplied from the very beginning? But we'll park that to the side. So one is stopping smuggling and rearming. The second is to maintain effective control of the strip, as I mentioned, and allow a quick counterinsurgency response. And another slightly more controversial, and this is certainly one of the suggestions that the government has, is that the ability to negotiate with Hamas comes from a position of strength. We were speaking before about military gains by the IDF, and that by withdrawing from key areas such as the Philadelphia corridor, it removes the bargaining chip or the ability to act so strongly against Hamas in the future, and the ability to bargain further in order to guarantee Israel's security and complete the aims of destroying Hamas's ability to rule both militarily and politically. Why for withdrawal? So again, we can see arguments between the defense establishment and the government. The government, I mentioned the Security Cabinet on Thursday, so the day after that call with Biden and Harris, with President Biden and Vice President Harris, the Security Cabinet on Thursday voted by 8-1 that removing Israeli forces from the Philadelphia corridor was off the table, and it was not going to happen. Of course, you can imagine that this was a huge reaction by the hostage families to a statement being made by the government that they felt was making it harder to be able to bring their children, their fathers, their brothers, their sisters, mothers home from captivity in Gaza. The defense establishment had argued that perhaps it is possible, by creating some form of new barrier, cameras, relying on promises from the Egyptians, that it would be possible to make sure that the smuggling and the tunnels would not be reopened or not be used without having Israeli forces present on the ground. You can also understand that there are many people in Israel, even if they would like to see some kind of compromise here, that are very cynical about the claims from the security establishment that cameras and barriers and promises from one side or another that are not Israelis themselves are guarantees of security. There was a strong feeling that on October the 7th, there were many feelings of underground barriers, above ground barriers, cameras, satellite imaging, but ultimately, and high-tech fences, but ultimately, a strong feeling inside Israel that it's been seen, or it's understood, that there is no substitute for boots on the ground. Another argument for withdrawal is the idea that, and this is one of the strong arguments, is that would it not be possible to withdraw now? And this is, again, the argument of Yoav Gallant, who is Israel's defense minister, is now completely at odds with the prime minister. He was the one person to vote against in the cabinet meeting, in the security cabinet meeting. And his argument was, would it not be possible to compromise on a certain level of withdrawal in order to get the hostages back? Why would this preclude Israel not re-entering into the area in the future if there was need be? So this is where things stand in the discussion. Public opinion in Israel is layered and complex, because on the one hand, it does seem that a majority of people in Israel do want to see an Israeli presence on the ground in the corridor. But on the other hand, there is a strong, significant number of people in Israel, even I would argue at least a small majority, that want the government to compromise in order to bring the hostages back. And we should mention that the events of Saturday evening, Sunday morning, that now we know, and I'll just bring up a picture over here of the 6 hostages whose bodies were returned. And they were formally identified around 4 o'clock in the morning Israeli time. That these 6 just unbelievably unfortunate, incredibly sad, just huge pain. That finding these 6 people inside tunnel, it was mentioned earlier on, and one of the people wrote on the chat, it's now understood that they were found executed with gunshot wounds, that they were found severely malnourished, and that it appears, according to the wounds that they suffered, that they were killed within the last 48 hours, within 48 hours of being discovered, meaning that they were summarily executed as the Israeli forces were advancing. Those holding them had been ordered to kill the hostages rather than let them be found alive. So again, this emphasizes this idea, or this strong feeling in Israeli society among so many people, that the government must do everything to bring back the hostages. I mentioned before the numbers that 8 hostages have been released through military action, 105 hostages were released through negotiations. We're seeing now that more and more people are being discovered killed, murdered inside Gaza. How many people will come back? Of the 101 remaining hostages, how many will come back alive if it will not be through some kind of negotiation, even if that negotiation is with an unspeakably evil force in Hamas? Very, very difficult situation. On the other hand, we also understand that, and Benjamin Netanyahu has said today, Hamas has refused to engage in genuine negotiations. On May 27th, Israel agreed to a hostage release deal with full US backing. Hamas refused. And even after the US revised the deal on August the 16th, we agreed and Hamas refused again. And he had a sentence which is, I think, incredibly powerful, but it can be seen from 2 different ways. He wrote, "Those who murder hostages are not interested in a deal." And on the one hand, it's very difficult to disagree with that statement. On the other hand, stating that the other side are not prepared to make a deal is a statement to certainly to the hostage families, from their perspective, that the government is not doing everything it can in order to try and persuade or influence, whether it be Hamas or the mediators or even Iran by proxy, to create some kind of deal to bring back hostages alive whilst they're still alive. Should mention that even before today, we've had a number of, and again, the hostage issue is one that is everywhere in Israeli society. We're coming up to the 1-year anniversary of October the 7th. Miri Regev, who is a minister in the government, who has often been tasked with responsibility for official ceremonies inside Israel, has been tasked with planning an official ceremony for a memorial ceremony for the events of October the 7th. Many of the members of the kibbutzim, the villages surrounding the Gaza Strip, stated very clearly that they were going to not take part in the ceremony because they didn't want to take part in a ceremony that was overseen by the government and certainly by the current government and those that are making up the security cabinet. We've seen many artists say that they're not going to be part of the ceremony and the idea of creating an alternative ceremony. So we now have, at the moment, still talk about two potential ceremonies, an official ceremony run by the government and another ceremony by those people who are angry and resentful at how they see and how they perceive the conduct of the government. The president of the State of Israel suggested that there should be some kind of ceremony that's run at the president's residence, some kind of neutral ceremony. But still, as we speak, there is still no coming together between these different sides. And this is certainly exacerbated by what has taken place over the course of the last week. During the past week, there were families who actually went to the Gaza border and entered into Gaza and were confronted and with the stated aim of literally going into Gaza, into the towns and bringing back their family members themselves. It was a big statement. Of course, very, very quickly, after 20 minutes or so, they were met by the IDF who persuaded them to go back to Israel. But nonetheless, you can feel and understand this resentment, but also this incredible pain that is coursing through the veins of people in Israeli society. And even just a few minutes before we came on air for the session, there was a statement by the Histadrut, which is the largest labor union in Israel, the calling of a general strike, I believe. And again, I'm not totally updated since we began the session, potentially a strike that will take place tomorrow. What is the chance of a deal with all of this coming on? On the one hand, the Americans still seem relatively positive that they can place pressure to bear on both Israel and Hamas, that some kind of deal will take place. Again, we mentioned that it does seem that it's incredibly important for the American administration, due to internal political interests related to the elections in November, to have some kind of ceasefire and hostage return before the elections take place. There's also questions over how much pressure will be placed to bear by the Arab world, whether it's possible that there will be some kind of give on the question of the corridor, especially with the pressure from inside from Israeli society, but also from the Americans as well. It's ultimately a very, very complicated situation. I'm going to say a few words because I want to finish in the next 20 minutes or so and then open up for questions. So again, I won't go into huge depth, but a word on Iran. We're speaking about Hamas and we're speaking about Hezbollah. But ultimately, much of what is going on, again, when any people are speaking about Israel Hamas or speaking about Israel Hezbollah and zooming in and not zooming out and understanding the interrelations between the whole situation. The Houthis of Yemen, again, a Shia terror organization who co-opted control of large swathes of Yemen, who are acting as a proxy largely on behalf of the Iranians. Speaking about Hamas, despite being Sunni and connected to the Muslim Brotherhood, who have a shared enemy in Iran, or a useful pawn in the game that Iran is playing with Israel, and likewise Hezbollah. So Iran is a real source of instability in the region, and something that we have seen over the last few months for the first time is direct confrontation between Iran and Israel. It's important to state that many people suggested that for example, the Israeli strike inside Lebanon on the building that was either related to or connected to the consul of Iran in Lebanon, and likewise the strike of the Iranians inside Israel, is not the first confrontation between the two sides, but it's simply the first confrontation that is directly one side to the other, because ultimately the Iranians have been using all of these other players in order to achieve their interest in the region. Mentioned before that the Russian foreign minister over the last few weeks visited Iran, put pressure on the Iranians not to create regional war. And also one small thing, if I'm looking for positives, is maybe related to the Abraham Accords, that following the Abraham Accords, related to the way that the American military relates to Israel, that Israel was moved to CENTCOM, which is the American military arrangement with its allies in the Arab world. And this relationship means that Israel is able to get a lot more intelligence. It's sharing intelligence and receiving intelligence from within the Arab world. And of course, we saw the coordinated defense of Israel against the Iranian strike back in April. And connected to this is also the acquiescence of certain players within the Arab world to the Americans sending warships, troops, and bringing more resources to its bases in the region in order to pressure Iran to limit its aggression towards Israel. So one positive thing that, again, in trying to separate off that even when we see a dysfunctional relationship at times between the American political echelon and the Israeli government, and we spoke about that conversation on Wednesday, and the motion that was passed within the Security Cabinet in Israel on Thursday, that the militaries of the two nations are very, very well coordinated, and again, the interest of both to try and avoid a regional war. What's going on the ground in Gaza? I mentioned that I will mention polio as well, which is going on right now at the moment. The image that you see over here is a polio vaccine being dropped into it's from today. It's there are numerous stations for polio vaccinations. There's the drop being placed in the children's mouth. I mentioned before, something like 1.2 million polio vaccines have been brought into the Gaza Strip, predominantly through the Kerem Shalom terminal, which is a terminal into Gaza from Israel towards the south of the Strip, that both Israel and Hamas have agreed to humanitarian pauses over the next 3 to 4 days in order to allow people to come to these stations and receive the vaccines. Again, polio is spread through unsanitary conditions, coming into contact with the feces, infected feces, and it's a terrible disease, an incredibly terrible disease. It's very important that, at least as I understand it, that at least 90% of the children of Gaza need to be vaccinated in order to stop the polio spreading. And so this is important not only for the children of Gaza, but also potentially for Egypt and for Israel as well. Diseases are not necessarily stopping at borders in the way that perhaps we would like. So this is a few words about the polio, and also just to combat one of the questions actually that I was asked was whether Israel is limiting or not, or encouraging. In fact, one of the questions I was asked is whether Israel is deliberately fomenting disease inside the Strip, whether it's deliberately trying to infect Palestinian children. And what we can see, that's certainly not the case, and actually that Israel is attempting to be part of the solution in trying to have vaccinations against the children. What we do understand is that in war, in a very, very built-up urban area, and a war that is being fought with terrorists who are refusing to acquiesce and basing themselves under civilian homes, makes finding a way of providing regular vaccinations and limiting these humanitarian disasters makes it very, very difficult to avoid those disasters. And again, here we come back to the question of, which is being asked around the world today, words of such as genocide, and the idea of whether in some way Israel is deliberately seeking to harm the Palestinian citizens of Gaza, or whether it's actually, again, trying to avoid the harm of the Palestinian citizens of Gaza and acquiesce or to be part of efforts to try and limit the impact of those things that have happened. Should also mention, I was also asked a question about aid workers and volunteers inside Gaza that have been struck. We had another incident over the last couple of weeks, and a significant number of months ago, we had the terrible incident with the World Central Kitchen and volunteers inside. And I think it's really important. Again, I will give my personal opinion here, and it's important for me to state, having given different narratives and context from different sides, that there is, again, no doubt that we can ask questions of the Israeli military, like any other military, of whether in certain instances, whether individual soldiers or units have taken due care or attention, whether they're also criminal acts. Again, someone asked me about images of people, of Israeli soldiers going into homes inside Gaza and stealing things or taking clothing, things that are incredibly immature, very distasteful, and abusive, if you will, things that I would absolutely and totally condemn. It's important to understand, and again, understanding and justifying are two very, very different things. One is the extent on all sides, both the Palestinian side and the Israeli side, of the anger and resentment and that has been fermented in the sides, how some people react incredibly inappropriately when those things take place. Also to mention that when something terrible happens, if we're speaking about an aid convoy being struck, for example, that there is a significant difference between a deliberate strike and mistakes, which unfortunately do happen in war, both in terms of friendly fire against one's own side and also against other actors in the region who are not actually combatants in the area as well. And I should also mention that part of the fog of war is that what is going on in Gaza, not only in Gaza, but what is going on in Gaza is an attempt to make it as difficult as possible for the Israeli forces to act in a way that doesn't affect the Palestinian civilian population. It's important for me to come back and to say that part of the strategy of Hamas, part of the military strategy and the war strategy, also in order to put international pressure on Israel, is for catastrophic, terrible events to take place. We can give the example, the example of an event that didn't take place, which was right at the very beginning of the war, post-October the 7th, was the destruction of the Al-Ahli hospital, which was claimed by international media such as Al Jazeera for a much longer, but even the BBC and the New York Times, who unquestionably took the narrative that Israel had destroyed a hospital. There was a narrative from Hamas, and the idea was to put pressure on Israel from the international community to condemn Israel so that Israel would have less ability to maneuver and to perform what it felt that it needed to do in the conflict. And these things are still going on. This week we saw that it was discovered a factory inside Gaza that was producing stickers for UN stickers that could then be placed on side vehicles. It was also being advertised. The idea being that non-UN vehicles would then be able to appear to be UN vehicles, could enter in. Now, on the one hand, one could argue that's in order to be able to, for ordinary Palestinians to be able to gain access to places that they want to gain access to by surreptitiously pretending to be a United Nations vehicle. But it also means if there are terror vehicles also moving into areas that UN vehicles are not allowed to go inside, or that only UN vehicles are allowed to go inside. Entering into those areas where there's a UN vehicle doesn't necessarily have permission to be in that area. It's essentially encouraging these mishaps and misnomers to happen. So it's a very, very difficult situation. Also, I was asked a question about journalists, and I'll also mention this as well, is that if one zooms out and looks at conflict, that especially in areas of active battle zone, journalists invariably go in embedded with forces, whether that's, for example, Russian forces or Ukrainian forces, if we're looking at that particular conflict. In the case of the conflict taking place in Gaza, that means that journalists are either going to be embedded with Israeli forces or de facto either embedded with Hamas, or in the case of what's going on in Gaza, by not being embedded with Israeli forces, the Israeli claim would be that they would de facto be under the control of the narrative of Hamas. And the third and most important thing is that if journalists are walking freely inside Gaza, even if they're not swayed by the narratives and propaganda of one side or the other, that a journalist being killed in the events that are taking place in the conflict will in itself completely and utterly change the conflict. What I did want to say, just to close out on this point, is that, and I'll say it again as we draw to a close, is that when I personally am listening to narratives, are those that are defending Israel to the hilt, and those that believe Israel is a amoral, genocidal regime, illegitimate regime, that ultimately these narratives come from one side or the other. It's either that Hamas are uniquely evil and Israel is uniquely good, or the flip side, that Hamas are defending the legitimate rights of Palestinian people, and that Israel is a uniquely evil force in the world, Jews/Israel/Zionists, etc. And the reality, and again, this is not excusing one or the other, but the reality is that we need to be able to hold different things together at the same time. That it's possible that there are elements within the IDF that are acting improperly. It's possible that mistakes have been made, or that undue attention hasn't been taken account of. But it's also at the same time possible to understand that the Israeli forces are dealing with an incredibly nuanced and difficult situation that is being deliberately made difficult for them by the forces that they're acting against. And that the Israeli forces do have a duty to defend Israel's citizens against the evil of Hamas, and so on and so forth. And it's possible to hold these two things in our hands at the same time. That one can be not necessarily the fully virtuous and moral, but that doesn't make one automatically utterly immoral. And I think this is important to say. And I mention it because it was brought up in a number of the questions that I was asked. In the last couple of minutes before we're coming to an end, and I'll just take another 10 minutes or so, or I'll attempt to. I want to speak for a few minutes about the West Bank, because this is a very important piece, and I think it's going to become even more important over the next few weeks and months. When I'm speaking about the West Bank, I'm speaking about this area over here, the West Bank, which was under Jordanian occupation and annexation between 1949 and 1967, came under Israeli occupation following the Six-Day War of 1967, and has been divided between Israeli rule and Palestinian Authority rule since the Oslo Accords of the 1990s. One of the claims, and actually was one of the things that was written to me about, is that since October the 7th, Israel has been acting not only inside Gaza, but also inside the West Bank. One of the fears, and I can tell you as someone who lives a stone's throw from the West Bank, one of the great fears was that after October the 7th, that a second front or another front would open up from the West Bank. And again, I won't open up on the map, but if we take Netanya is approximately here, Tulkarem is approximately here. There's around 10 miles between Netanya and Tulkarem, the width of Israel, so we can understand the strategic issues, military problems that would occur if there was another front opening up from the West Bank. And one of the efforts has been by the IDF over the last 11 months or so has been to quash and to limit the emanation of terrorism coming out of the West Bank and into Israel. One of the claims, and again, it was something that was written to me, is why is Israel operating in the West Bank when Hamas don't exist in the West Bank? Important to state that Hamas very much do exist in the West Bank, as do Islamic Jihad, and as do other organizations as well, in significant numbers, and also with great popularity, arguably more popular than actually amongst the Palestinian population within the Gaza Strip. However, unlike Gaza, there are Israeli forces, we have Israeli settlements, we'll speak about settlers in a few moments' time as well. But there are Israeli forces that are able to act inside the West Bank, which makes a huge difference in the ability to first act against terrorism, but also in terms of intelligence, actually being able to have human intelligence and other forms of intelligence inside the West Bank. Over the last few weeks, we have seen a sea change. We've seen more and more terrorists attempts at terrorism coming from the West Bank. There have been attempts to smuggle not only weapons, knives, which is something that we've seen before, but now explosive devices into Israel. A number of attempts have been thwarted. There was a terrorist device a couple of weeks ago that was brought into Tel Aviv with the idea of blowing it up inside Tel Aviv, and the terrorist actually was the terrorist, and a passerby was the only person injured when it prematurely blew up. Khaled Mashal, one of the leaders of Hamas, has called for an open return to suicide bombings. And so we understand that things are changing. And again, my prediction, although I hope very much that I'm wrong, is that we are going to see more and more coming out of the West Bank, whether it will be in the form of another front, whether it will be in the form of an intifada. This is a word that we're hearing a lot, sort of a violent uprising against Jews and against Israel. But these are things that are warming up. This week, and I mentioned that on Wednesday of this week, the IDF ramped up significant operations in Tulkarem, in Jenin, and now in Hebron as well, also in the Jordan Valley as well. Large numbers of ammunitions were discovered, bomb-making equipment were discovered. A lot of terror figures who are wanted by Israel were also either killed, arrested. One in particular, his name is Mohammed Jaber, very famous, was killed by Israeli forces in Tulkarem on Thursday. Was one of the heads of the Tulkarem Brigade. And right now, most of the efforts are focused on Jenin, and especially now Hebron, after the events of today and the murder of 3 police. As I understand, just before we came on air, that I understand that the IDF killed in the Israeli in the political parlance, the word neutralized is used. That Israel took out the terrorists responsible for killing the three police at a checkpoint, or it's a sort of a guard post just outside Hebron. And I think someone actually put it on the chat a little earlier on. It's very tragic that the policeman that was killed, his daughter is also in the police, and she was killed in Sderot on the 7th of October. So 11 months later, her father was also killed as well. So this is what's going on in the West Bank. And again, important to say, and I'm going to speak about the settlers in a few moments, important to say that on the one hand, there is a legitimate need to focus on Hamas, Islamic Jihad. I should mention, by the way, that this week there were a number of Islamic Jihad terrorists who actually handed themselves into the Palestinian Authority police because they understood, they were fearful that had they stayed on the streets that they would be killed by Israeli forces, and so they actually handed themselves in, and they're now in Palestinian Authority prison in order to avoid what they would consider a worse fate at the hands of the Israeli forces. These things are happening inside the West Bank. That more and more attempts to infiltrate into Israel are taking place, and I think this is a story that you unfortunately a story that you're going to need to keep an eye on. What I will say is that one of the suggestions is that and again we can ask the question, is this something that happens independently, or is it possible that part of the ability of the terror organizations to recruit more Palestinians are, of course, what's happening in Gaza, but also is that whether there is a response within Palestinian society to violence against Palestinians by settlers. And a few words about settlers, because it's important to explain what I mean by settlements. And I'm sure there are very different political opinions amongst different people that are on this session. So settlements, the word settlement refers to Israeli towns and villages and cities that were created after 1967 in this area. But remember, before 1967, this area was under, in fact, I'll show you here. This area was under Jordanian occupation and annexation, and after 1967, it came into Israeli control. After 1967, the subsequent Israeli governments allowed and even encouraged the creation of new towns, villages, and cities to be created inside this area, in and amongst the Palestinian towns and villages. For many, those people living in these areas are considered pioneers. In Hebrew, there are 2 words for settlement, itnachalut and hityashvut. And itnachalut has a negative connotation. This idea of you're a settler, meaning you've settled somewhere you're not supposed to be. This idea that this area is not part of Israel and shouldn't be part of Israel, and that settlements are illegal under international law. And there are those that argue that this area that this area was never legally Jordanian. It was never Palestine, and as such, that this area is technically not a place that's illegal for Jews to live in, that it's Judea and Samaria, the heartland of the Jewish people, and that the people living here are doing their national and religious duty by living in these areas. Should also mention that there are people living in those areas, if we, again, using the word settlers, who are living there for practical reasons, cheaper homes, cheaper land, better quality of life. And there are also those that are there either for nationalist and religious ideological reasons as well. So their behavior is different. Their relationship with the state is also very, very different as well. The reason I mention this is to explain that not all settlers are the same, and that when we're speaking about settler violence, we're generally speaking about a particular group of settlers who tend to be more right-wing, more extreme, ideologically both either nationalist or religious, but there are also groups within them that place the idea of Eretz Israel, or the land of Israel, above the state of Israel. And that also causes questions or problems because they don't necessarily find themselves beholden to the law of Israel, or they don't necessarily listen to the police or the IDF, and making it harder to stop or go against them. They don't necessarily think about the political implications of the terrible behavior that they're performing, and what impact that has on the safety and security of the citizens of Israel, or on Israel standing overseas. So when we're speaking about settler violence, this is what we're speaking about. And I'm going to raise a number of points here, and a lot of this was written in questions to me. One of the questions that was asked to me is, are Israeli authorities complicit in this violence? And again, I'm going to raise a number of standpoints. So one argument is that Israeli authorities are not doing enough to stop it. Why could that be? Could it be because individual police and soldiers are, again, influenced by events? They also perhaps have sympathy ideologically for some of those people. And where does this leave the state of Israel if there are members within the security establishment who allow their own personal ideologies to affect the way that they conduct things? Should also mention that we're speaking about the police, that the national security minister responsible for much of the policing is Itamar Ben-Gvir, who is very much to the right of the political spectrum, a religious nationalist. And so there are many people that would suggest that with the head or the person responsible for the policing also being sympathetic to some of the ideological trends present amongst these more extreme violent settlers, makes it more of a challenge for the police to actually do something about it. I mentioned before about, is it a priority? Remember that Israel is also, if we're speaking about the IDF inside the West Bank, the IDF is incredibly stretched. We're now speaking about changing the law in order that reservists will be called up for longer. There will be a law that will enable them to be called up for more time, to come back on more occasions. That Israel is stretched both in the West Bank and in Gaza, and everything we were speaking about in the north. So one could also ask the question, how much of a priority is it for the IDF specifically to deal with settlers and their violence, as opposed to the violence of Palestinians inside the West Bank, who are as an external enemy to the state of Israel, Gaza, Hezbollah, and so on? Again, important for me to say, this is not me suggesting that the violence of settlers is acceptable. I believe that it's very much not, and I do believe actually that it is a strong priority for Israel to deal with it. I should also mention something else which is important to understand. Difficult, complicated, and not ideal, I would argue, that Israeli citizens who live in the West Bank, i.e. those living over the Green Line, living in those villages, towns, settlements, etc., are Israeli citizens, and legally the responsibility for upholding the law for Israeli citizens in the West Bank is the police. And if someone is arrested, then they are the responsibility of the Israeli civil legal system, the civilian courts. Whereas Palestinians in the West Bank are answerable to the Israeli military, so the IDF and military courts. So if we're speaking, for example, about a conflagration or a violent act, whether it's Palestinians against settlers or settlers against Palestinians, there are different reshuyot, there are different authorities that are responsible, in theory, for dealing with those two different groups, even when it's the same event and the same people at the same time. So this is also makes it problematic in terms of responsibility or abdicating responsibility. I will also say on a very painful level that when we're speaking about the settler violence going on, not only are we speaking about making it more difficult, and I was talking about holding two things at the same time. How can we talk about the need for the Israeli IDF to act inside the West Bank for real security issues? That there is terrorism, there is Hamas, there is Islamic Jihad, and there are real threats, but also to criticize the IDF if we believe that it's not doing enough to combat settler violence and criticize those groups of settlers that are carrying out that violence themselves. How can we hold those two things in our hands at the same time? We understand that most of the world, be it the media or most people in general, are looking for simple answers and are not able to necessarily to hold that complexity. That if one sees something wrong, one assumes that everything is wrong. If one sees something that is right, one believes everything is right, and the reality is a lot more complicated. And again, I'm going to speak for our last point about the Temple Mount, that this question of settler violence that we're seeing, even when it's so damaging for Israel's international reputation, and also potentially stoking fires amongst Palestinians in the West Bank, the inability or the non-acting against settler violence. Again, settlers are being arrested and they are going through the courts, but it's slow, it's laborious, it takes time, it's the police, it's not the IDF. And this potentially also emphasizes schisms within Israeli society. We were speaking before about Farhan Al-Qadi, about feeling, he used the term Mother Israel, about we're all in it together. But for many people, it's hard to feel that they're in it together when they see other Israelis who don't necessarily respect them or feel that or see everyone else as a full player within Israeli society. So we're speaking about, again, things that are potential causes of further disintegration of social cohesion between Israeli people, be they Jewish, be they Arab, be they left, right, secular, religious. In order for a society to function, we need to have some kind of contract between ourselves as citizens, that there's enough in common, a machaneh meshutaf, some kind of common, some consensus about enough things that mean that we can feel that we're part of something together. So things like this break down that contract between Israelis. And the last thing before I finish it off is talking about the Temple Mount. So some of you may know that, and I mentioned it right at the beginning, that Itamar Ben-Gvir, the Israeli Minister for National Security, was interviewed this week, and he said that he believes that Jews should be able to pray on Temple Mount. When he was pushed by the journalist, and he was asked, do you think there should be a synagogue? He eventually answered and said, yes, I think there should be a synagogue on the Temple Mount. I'll just show a picture for just a moment, just to understand. This is a picture of the Temple Mount. You can see over here, it's about 1/6 of the whole size of the old city. This is the Dome of the Rock. This is the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And this entire area is what Jews call the Temple Mount, what Muslims call Al-Aqsa, or the Holy Sanctuary. Before 1960 or before 1948, this area was British mandate. Before that, Ottoman. It wasn't controlled by any country as part of a nation state. After 1948, it came under Jordanian occupation, and the Jordanians annexed Jerusalem along with the West Bank. This became Jordan. Under Jordanian law, it was an illegal annexation recognized by the British and by the Pakistanis, but nonetheless, it came under Jordanian occupation and annexation. And after 1967, this area came under Israeli control. Israel occupied the Old City, East Jerusalem, and the West Bank. With time, the eastern side of Jerusalem together with the Old City was annexed to become part of Jerusalem, a unified Jerusalem. It's the capital of the state of Israel under Israeli law. And according to Israeli law, this is within the official borders of the state of Israel. The decision was taken very, very early on and it was actually initially, some of you may have heard of Rav Goren, that initially there was Jewish prayer up on top. There was a yeshiva or a seminary that was open, but ultimately it was taken down, and the decision was taken to create a status quo agreement that has been in place ever since. And that status quo agreement says that non-Muslims are able to enter this area to visit for a certain time each day, as long as it doesn't interfere with Islamic prayer, that Muslims are able to enter this area at any time of day, and that only Muslims are allowed to pray in this area. Now, when we hear this idea of Jews being able to pray and seeing now Jews going up, walking around the outside, staying around the outside, but nonetheless prostrating themselves, but starting to whisper and speak prayers to themselves, many people in the world see this as something that this is a shift in the status quo. They see it as something that is inciting violence amongst Palestinians. Many people would argue that it's something that isolates Israel. It's a sign again of the extreme taking over Israeli society, potentially alienates Arabs within Israel, Arab Muslims inside Israel, who will feel again that perhaps that the state is in some way changing the contract together with them, and that it's maybe fomenting terror recruitment in some way. So this is the argument for those that will oppose statements such as that of Itamar Ben-Gvir. Their argument will be that everything that I've just said is very, very problematic as a result of attempting to shift the status quo. There are others that look at things slightly differently, and I'm going to play devil's advocate here for you, that in Israel, there is only one place in Israel where there is not religious freedom. Within Israel, there is freedom of religion for all peoples across the state of Israel. And the only place in the state of Israel where there is no religious freedom, or there is a lack of religious freedom, is here, where Jews are not able to pray at the holiest place in the world, the area of and surrounding where the Jewish first and second temple stood. So many people would argue that the status quo that was arbitrarily enacted in 1967 actually enacts a situation where Jews in the Jewish state are unable to pray in a place that is most holy for them. Now, this actually went to the Supreme Court in the state of Israel, and the decision from the Supreme Court is that it is actually technically it's not acceptable legally in Israel to prevent a Jew praying in this area. However, if by praying in this area, it would cause violence, it would cause Muslims/Arabs to be violent as a result of Jews praying in this area, then security trumps religious freedom. And the argument for many people would be, and they would argue with an element of justification, how can it be that the reason that Jews are not able to pray in a holy place for Jews is because other people are not able to control themselves if Jews will pray in this area? So these are the arguments. And something else that's interesting that started to become in the last few days that I've been hearing more and more is this idea that if the argument is that Israel will be isolated as a result of changing the status quo, of allowing Jews. And again, it's important to state that even when Ben-Gvir was quoted, he wasn't stating that a synagogue would be built instead of a mosque, or he wasn't stating that Muslims would not be able to pray. In fact, what he was saying is that Muslims are able to pray in this area, and Jews should be able to pray there too. It was pretty much to quote him. And so one of the things that I've heard more and more over the last few days is that if Jews are not able to pray in this area because it might cause violence, but we're already seeing violence, and we're already seeing terror, and we're already seeing incitement, we're already seeing all of these things, and if the idea of Jews not praying in this place is innately wrong, then why shouldn't there be a decision to shift the status quo? Or if Israel is increasingly internationally isolated anyway, why would it matter if Israel will now actually do something that's in its interest? And the last thing, which I also think is again interesting as a counterbalance, playing devil's advocate with you, is the mindset in Israel, and part of the mindset of pre-October the 7th, was a Western mindset of, if you placate someone, if you placate your enemy, if you give them things that will calm them down and they won't react. The idea that if you can give money to Hamas, or you expect that, or you make them, or you ensure that they're busy dealing with the Palestinian civilian population, that they won't act against Israel. What was seen on October the 7th is ultimately that we're in the Middle East, and that in the Western world there's an idea that when you're strong, you should concede in order to show, as sort of to be benevolent, in order to come to a solution. And very often in the Middle East, the argument would be that actually in the Middle East, it's only strength that works and only strength that is respected. And actually that making a change on the status quo and allowing Jews to have some form of prayer in the area would in some way show the Palestinians, show Hamas, show the jihad, etc., show Hezbollah, show Iran, that when you do something in the order of the magnitude that was done on October the 7th, when you attack Israel as Iran has done and is doing through its proxies and Hezbollah, the result that you're going to get is not what you want, but the opposite. This would be the counter argument. Again, it's very difficult. And again, I encourage you also to try and hold different things in your hands at the same time. It's possible to thoroughly reject the ideological direction of one leader or another, one politician or another, and also have some kind of understanding of the complexity of the issues. Even broken clocks can be correct twice a day. It's not to suggest that in this instance Ben-Gvir is correct, but nonetheless, it is possible for people that we don't respect also to bring things to the table that are more nuanced and more complicated than we would care to think about. The last thing I'm going to speak about, and very much just to bring things to a close, is again bring you back to the question that I was asked a number of times on email. How are Israelis feeling? Israelis are feeling desperate. Israelis are feeling very devoid of hope and inspiration. Israelis are feeling financially challenged. The economy is seeing a downturn. National debt is rising, not only in the north, but in the north, particularly in the north, businesses and livelihoods are failing. But that's happening all over the country. There are many independent freelancers, a lot of small business owners who are losing their businesses because of reserve duty, that they're not able to keep their businesses functioning. There are families that are dysfunctional as a result of parents that are not present. Of the 2.5 million adults, working age adults, or of the adult population rather of Israel, about 2.5 million, that's about 39.3% of the adult population of Israel, have an overdraft on their current account. That doesn't mean that they have a mortgage or a car loan. It means that they're literally overdrawn and they have minus money in their bank account. And again, these interest charges are about 11%. So about 40% of the adult population of Israel have less than zero money in their bank account, and it's getting worse and worse and worse. So financially, things are very difficult. Israelis are worried about security. Either they support the government and they're very angry with those citizens that are criticizing the government, or they're very angry at the government. But either way, most Israelis are angry and resentful and feeling betrayed by someone, whether it's the government or whether it's the other citizens. They're very worried about the security situation. And I would also argue that a lot of Israelis feel very let down by the world, and feel that the world doesn't understand, that the world sees things in very binary ways, that is not holding things in both, not being able to hold two things at the same time. I think one of the best examples of this was that recently there was a UN exhibition on victims of terror that was opened, and there was one Palestinian who was mentioned, who was actually, I think, attacked in Canada, and there was not one mention of any acts of terror against against Israelis, and certainly nothing with regard to October the 7th. So I think that Israelis are feeling personally isolated. I think there's a national depression in many ways. And I think on that uplifting note, I will finish it there. But what I will say is that on a very personal level, I refuse not to have hope. I will say that over the course of Israel's short history, that the moments of greatest change in Israel for the better have generally come after the greatest periods of crisis. It's hard to see it at the moment, but I hope that this crisis that we're in many ways at the moment will create the seeds of change that will see things change in a way that maybe none of us could have imagined, but that will emerge from this. All of us across the region will emerge from it stronger.
I'm reluctant to speak as the first, what shall I say, substantive problem, but I have very negative responses. I must say I've been subscribing to Haaretz for 3 years now. It's largely colored my view of what's possible in Israel and what's wrong with Israel. And in the chat, you didn't notice perhaps, I said you aren't really dealing with Netanyahu, but Israel is led by a leader who does not have the interests of Israel as his primary interests, his own interests. So read Haaretz, you'll find that on every page. That's the first thing. This is the immediate problem. There wouldn't be this Ben Gvir government if it weren't for Netanyahu's personal predicament, okay? And he's using all of these issues to obfuscate the fact that he's not going to go toward whatever is going to be a long-term benefit to Israel. And the United States is in a terrible position because they would like to react differently to Netanyahu and to Israel, but they can't separate them. What you said about the Democrats and they want to get it wrapped up before the election, I don't think that's right. I think they have been consistently trying to have both peace and a good relation with Israel. It may change in the future.
If it's okay to respond to you on it, first of all, thank you so much. I think what you said is a very legitimate viewpoint regarding like the genuine wish of America to support Israel. And again, I mentioned the on the same telephone call on Wednesday that Biden was very careful to sort of nudge Netanyahu in the direction regarding the Philadelphia corridor, but then was met, as you mentioned, with sort of a very categorical, we are not leaving the corridor. But he also was very much emphasizing that the USA is there to support the security needs to defend Israel against the Iranian threat. So I think it's possible to hold two things at the same time. I'm not suggesting you are, but I think it would be naive to suggest that it would not be politically expedient for the Americans to have a ceasefire before November. But it's also at the same time doesn't mean that the only reason that the US administration wants a ceasefire is for its own narrow domestic political interests. I thank you for your voice, because I think that the voice that you gave is a representative actually of an Israeli voice, of the Haaretz reading Israeli voice.
Correct.
What I would say is that if you read only Haaretz, then you might believe that Netanyahu and Sinwar are ultimately kind of up there together. And if you read the right-wing Israeli press, you're going to believe that ultimately that what Netanyahu is doing is because he's Mr. Security. And the reality is that Netanyahu is not Mr. Security, as was evidenced on October the 7th, even though he often claims to be. But it's also important to understand that I would argue that those that are holding up Netanyahu as satanic, if you will, are also looking at things rather simplistically. And the reality, it's much more complicated than that.
Two questions I have for you. Do you know if there was any attempt to negotiate hostage releases in exchange for the vaccination pauses?
As far as I'm aware, there was no linkage made between those things. I think for good reason. And I think it's a good thing that they were not linked, because I think the children who need polio vaccinations is, and again, whether it's Hamas' responsibility for the humanitarian disaster, or whether it's Israel's, or whether it's Sinwar's, or whether it's Netanyahu's, that ultimately there are children that need polio vaccinations. And on a very human level, it's important. First of all, it's important that those vaccinations get done. And therefore, I think this is why Israel has been part of facilitating it. I also think, I'm sure, that had Israel linked polio vaccinations to hostage release, it would have been viewed very, very cynically. If part of the claim against Hamas is that Hamas are inhuman in the way that they are behaving to threaten a Palestinian civilian population with mass outbreak of polio, if Hamas don't give back hostages, I think would be personally, I think it would be morally untenable, but I also think it wouldn't be expedient politically either.
Does this make any difference do you think people are wanting to leave Israel? Do you think families are wanting a different sort of life for their families and wanting to leave Israel, or people are still staying?
I think it's complicated. I think that there are people here who are feeling very, very desperate. I'm sure that there are people that will wish to leave, but I think there are also a lot of people that will say, well, where would one go? That people are looking, a lot of Israelis are looking at what's going on around the world and the way that Israelis are perceived, in the same way that many people around the world are looking at Israel in a very sort of as this sort of bastion of immorality. And I think a lot of Israelis are looking what's going on around the world and are seeing societies that they wouldn't necessarily want to be part of either. So I think it's a very desperate situation. There's certainly been an upspike in Jewish immigration, aliyah, to Israel post October 7th. But nonetheless, it's also but you'll get both. I know that there are Jews in the UK or the United States or other countries that some of you are located in who will say, we need to get out, things are changing and we need to get out. And there are also those that are saying it's all being over-egged.
Very quickly, Netanyahu, I thought everyone said he's only in it for himself because he wants to stay out of jail. And the longer he can keep all this going, the longer it'll be before he's actually before the courts for corruption. And leads me into the thing about the Israeli media, because I've heard from family in Israel and Israeli friends that the Israeli media does not cover what's going on in Gaza. It constantly, day after day, reruns October the 7th, so that people feel this terrible victim feeling, which was absolutely, it was a horrendous thing that happened, but to run it and run it and run it and not show what's happening on the other side just seems to be appalling.
Let me try and remember. First of all, thank you for your opinions.
Sorry, I feel quite
No.
about it.
So the first thing that you mentioned was about Netanyahu. I will say, if I'm honest with you, and again, I may well be wrong, but I don't believe that Netanyahu is making decisions now regarding Gaza in order not to go to prison. That's not to say that he isn't making decisions because of other interests. So don't get me wrong, but my feeling is that he ultimately there will be a plea deal, that if it will happen, there will be a plea deal, there will be some kind of dishonorable discharge, if you will. But ultimately, I believe that for the good of the social cohesion of Israel, that it wouldn't necessarily come to that. And I think he knows that. But what I would say is, and again, I don't want this to become a back and forth. What I would say is, I think that the points that you're making and Jeff are making regarding remaining in power and his weakness, actually, and I think this is one of the things that a lot of people sort of around the world will that Netanyahu is making decisions because he wants this and because he wants that, or because he doesn't care about this. I think in many ways that, and this is my opinion, that to an extent, the format of the Israeli political system and the decisions he made in order to remain in power have in many ways emasculated him and brought him to a point where he's largely in some way being controlled by his coalition partners. So for example, if a ceasefire deal was made that would not be satisfactory to the far right, and that the far right parties would pull out of the coalition, that would see the demise of the government. The second thing I would say is you were mentioning about Haaretz. For those that don't know, Haaretz means the land. It's a left-wing Hebrew language newspaper that also publishes online in English. That Haaretz over the last 15 years or so has gone a lot more left. And again, this is not a critique. I'm not suggesting whether you're left or right, whether one is better or the other, but this is where it has gone. And if you will read only Haaretz, you will see the world in one way. If you will read only Ma'ariv, you will see it in another way. And if you read only Yediot Achronot, you're going to see it. If you read Israel Hayom only, then you're going. For those that know, will know what I'm talking about. What I will say is the same is true on the Israeli television channels. If you watch channel 14 on Israeli television, then the likelihood is that you're probably chosen to watch that channel because you want to be in a right of center, religious or right of center echo chamber. And the chances are that if you only watch channel 13, you probably want to watch television with everyone who detests Netanyahu and all of the people that read Haaretz, but that are still lowbrow enough to still watch television news. But the reality is that depending on which press you read and which television stations you watch, you get a very, very different picture. And it's no different to the media overseas. I would argue that part of the problem today, and I think for all of us, including the avid Haaretz readers, and including the avid Channel 14 TV watchers on the other side, is that we live in an age where we have so much media, both formal and informal, both social media and X, and we consume so much media that we believe that we're getting a full picture. But for the most part, that we are siloed, maybe even more so. But at least once we were siloed, and we knew we were siloed, but now we don't think we're siloed because we think we have access to everything that's that's going on. What I'm going to do, first of all, thank you all for staying with me, and I've also stayed because I really enjoyed the discussion and hearing the questions. And even if we don't agree with each other, I think one of the things that's really nice about this has been that even if we don't all agree with each other, that we can listen to each other and accept that other people have different points of view. And I think we could do with a lot more of that right now, not only in Israel but in general. So thank you for this. If you'd like, I can leave open. I can leave open the Zoom so you can continue to chat. But I'm going to say thank you so much. If you have any more questions and thoughts, you're welcome to be in touch with me. Lots of love, and I hope to see you in a couple of weeks.